Albert Bender stood motionless as one of the men reached toward the stack of newsletters spread across his desk. Copies of his newsletter Space Review, membership records, letters from people around the country. The stranger's hand hovered over all of it. Bender didn't move. He didn't ask who the men were. He didn't ask how they'd gotten inside his house. He simply watched. There were 3 of them. Dark suits, dark hats, faces that revealed almost nothing. For several seconds, no one spoke. The men looked at Bender. Bender looked back. No one seemed nervous. No one seemed hurried. One of the men finally broke the silence. He knew about the International Flying Saucer Bureau. He knew about the newsletters Bender had been mailing across the country. He knew details no stranger should have known. The stranger stepped closer. His message was only 2 words. Stop publishing. Albert Bender believed the flying saucer question could be organized, studied, and maybe even contacted. At 784 Broad Street in Bridgeport, that belief didn't stay in his head. It sat on his desk. It filled envelopes. It moved through letters, membership records, and copies of Space Review being mailed to people who believed something unusual was happening in the skies. Then, according to Bender, something came back to the same room where those papers were kept. It didn't appear over a road. It didn't hover over a field. It came into his house. And after that, the man who had been mailing Space Review to UFO believers across the country stopped sending it. I'm your host, Robert Barber. Today, we're going back to Bridgeport, Connecticut in the early 1950s, when flying saucers were still new enough to feel like a question the whole country was trying to answer. This is the story of Albert Bender and the Men in Black, the reported warning that helped create one of the most enduring figures in American UFO folklore. And this is State of the Unknown. Before Albert Bender became linked to the Men in Black, he was living in Bridgeport, Connecticut. His address was 784 Broad Street. He lived there with his family in a city of factories, storefronts, and working people. Bender had an ordinary job. He worked as a timekeeper, the kind of work built around schedules and records. During the day, his life had structure. There were hours to track, records to keep, a routine to follow. But upstairs, in his private space, there was another side of his life. Bender's attic became known as his Chamber of Horrors. It had strange decorations, horror-themed objects, and clocks that marked the passing time. Visitors remembered this place for its eerie character, and Bender leaned into it. That same upstairs room became the center of his UFO work. Bender wasn't standing in front of a crowd when this began. He wasn't a military officer, and he wasn't a scientist in a laboratory. He was a civilian working from inside his own home. In that room, letters arrived and were opened. Saucer reports were read. Names were added to membership records. Another issue of Space Review was assembled from the material spread across his desk. In 1952, Bender founded the International Flying Saucer Bureau. From Bridgeport, he began organizing members. The Bureau published a newsletter called Space Review. It carried reports and saucer discussion for people who believed there was something real behind the sightings being reported across the country. The Bureau reportedly grew to about 600 members. For a civilian UFO group in the early 1950s, that wasn't nothing. It meant envelopes arriving at the house. It meant names being added to lists. It meant people waiting for the next issue of Space Review to show up in the mail. Bender also wrote beyond Bridgeport. He contacted prominent figures, including Albert Einstein and Eddie Rickenbacker. Einstein declined involvement, but Bender still made the request. From the attic on Broad Street, he was trying to attach serious names to the saucer reports on his desk. Inside that upstairs room, the clock sounded, the papers piled up, and correspondence moved in and out. The flying saucer question wasn't only something Bender was reading about, it was part of his daily routine. Outside the house, newspapers carried flying saucer sightings. People looked up. The Cold War gave every unexplained object in the sky another layer of anxiety. A report that might once have sounded strange could now be read as foreign technology, a military experiment, or something from beyond Earth. Inside 784 Broad Street, Albert Bender kept working. Envelopes arrived. Reports were opened. Another issue of Space Review took shape on the desk. The next mailing went out, then another. Before long, people across the country were waiting for the next issue to arrive. In March of 1953, Albert Bender pushed the International Flying Saucer Bureau beyond collecting reports. He called the effort World Contact Day. On March 15, 1953, Bender asked members of the Bureau to take part in a synchronized attempt at mental contact. The time was set for 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. At that hour, members were supposed to focus their thoughts on the same message. It began calling occupants of interplanetary craft. For Bender, this wasn't just a slogan. It was something to be printed, memorized, and repeated at the same time by people in different rooms, in different places, all aiming their thoughts toward the same unknown point. As the hour approached in Bridgeport, the clocks were there, the papers were there, the desk was still covered with Bureau material. But now the Bureau was no longer just receiving stories from people who believed they had seen something. Now the Bureau was trying to speak back. At 6 o'clock, the attempt began. People in different places silently repeated the message, aiming their thoughts toward whatever they believed might be listening. There were no machines involved, no radio tower, no military equipment. Just people sitting in separate rooms, repeating the same words at the same time. Then the moment passed. The evening continued. Bender was still in the house, with the message sent and no answer he could point to. After World Contact Day, Bender said unusual things began happening around him. There were phone calls that didn't feel normal. There were headaches. There were impressions or messages that Bender interpreted as telepathic. At times, he reportedly felt watched. Some accounts also described the smell of sulfur in his attic room, a detail that would later stay close to the darker side of the case. In Bender's version of events, these things came through ordinary parts of the house. A phone call, a smell in the room, a headache that came on while he was alone upstairs. Nothing about the house had visibly changed. His desk was still covered with letters, reports, and unfinished pages of Space Review. The clock still marked the hour. But Bender's own account keeps returning to that room. The phone could ring. A smell could linger. A headache could come on in the quiet. The Bureau had put his name in circulation. Space Review had carried his ideas into other houses. World Contact Day had told members across the country exactly when to sit, concentrate, and repeat the same message. And after that, Bender's version of events brings everything back to the house on Broad Street. By the summer of 1953, it was no longer just letters arriving in the mail. It was 3 men, dark clothing, and a warning delivered beside the papers he had been preparing. By July of 1953, Bender said 3 men came to his home in Bridgeport. They were dressed in dark clothing. They wore dark hats. In later descriptions, they had a clergyman-like appearance. They weren't described as frantic or wild. They were controlled, serious, direct. They didn't have to raise their voices. They were already inside the room. According to Bender, the visitors knew about his work. They knew about the International Flying Saucer Bureau. They knew about the newsletters he had been gathering, assembling, and mailing. In one newspaper-era version, the visitors showed credentials from a quote-unquote higher authority. At the time, the phrase suggested official power. Later, in UFO folklore, it would take on a stranger meaning. Inside the room, they weren't only an idea. They were standing near Bender's desk, near the newsletters, near the papers that connected him to the people across the country. They were asking about the Bureau, and they told him to stop. Bender had turned his private room into a place where saucer reports arrived, names were recorded, and newsletters were mailed back out. Now, according to him, strangers had come directly into that room. A strange phone call could fade after the receiver went down. A headache could pass. A feeling of being watched could stay inside the mind. But 3 figures inside the room were different. They occupied space. They looked at the papers. They asked questions. Bender wasn't only being told to stop. He was watching strangers handle the newsletters. And in his account, the visitors took some of the material with them. After the visit, some versions include a yellow mist and the smell of sulfur. In the versions where those details appear, the room doesn't simply return to normal after the visitors leave. Something is left in the air. The visitors are gone. The papers are gone. And Bender is left inside the same room where the Bureau had been operating. For a moment, there's no next issue. No new report to assemble. No appeal to members. Just the room, the missing papers, and the warning. In the weeks that followed, Bender made a decision. The International Flying Saucer Bureau would not continue. Weeks after the reported visit, Albert Bender sat down to prepare one final issue of Space Review. By October of 1953, it was ready to mail. The same kind of pages that had once carried saucer reports, bureau notices, and messages to members now carried something different. A warning. Bender wrote that the source of the flying saucer mystery was known, but that the information was being withheld by orders from a higher source. Then he told the people still involved in saucer work to be very cautious. The warning went into print. Members could hold it in their hand. For anyone who had followed the Bureau, this wasn't another call for reports. It wasn't just another request for cooperation. It wasn't another invitation to reach outward. It was Bender stepping back. The Bureau was closing. The publication was ending. And the last message to readers was caution. Members opened the final issue expecting another newsletter. They had joined a group built around curiosity. They had received Space Review in the mail. They'd been asked to take part in World Contact Day, sitting in separate rooms at the same hour, repeating the same message toward whatever they believed might be listening. Now they were holding a warning from the man who had organized it. Bender had asked them to look up. Now he was telling them to be careful. The story didn't stay inside the mailing list. Soon, local newspaper coverage brought Bender's account into public view. A Bridgeport Sunday Herald article titled "Mystery Visitors Halt Research" reported what Bender said had happened. In that newspaper account, the visitors appeared to be understood as officials or government-connected figures. That reading made sense in 1953. Reports of flying saucers were already moving through newspapers, living rooms, and government offices. People were used to hearing that some things were being kept quiet. A strange object overhead could be a sighting, a military secret, or a warning sign from somewhere else. So when Bender said men had come to his home and told him to stop, people had a frame for it. Maybe he had attracted official attention. Maybe his publication had reached the wrong people. Maybe someone knew more than they were saying. But whatever readers believed about the men, the visible result was the same. Bender stopped. The International Flying Saucer Bureau ended after a brief, intense life. Space Review was gone. The room at 784 Broad Street no longer sent out the next issue. Anyone could doubt what Bender said happened inside his home, but they could see that the Bureau had ended. They could read the final warning. They could watch one of the early civilian UFO organizers walk away. For a while, that was what remained. A closed bureau, a final issue, a warning no one could fully explain, and Albert Bender no longer mailing the pages he had built his name around. Albert Bender walked away from the Bureau, but the account didn't stay still. In 1956, Gray Barker published "They Knew Too Much About Flying Saucers." Barker was a writer inside the UFO publishing world, and his book carried Bender's account far beyond Bridgeport. Readers who had never seen the house at 784 Broad Street, never received Space Review, and never belonged to the Bureau could now encounter the same image. 3 dark-suited visitors, a warning, a UFO researcher who stopped publishing. The book gave Bender's account a longer life than the Bureau itself. The organization had closed. The newsletter had ended. But the image of the visitors remained. And once that image was in circulation, other UFO readers had something to recognize. A person sees something or studies something, and then someone comes to stop them from talking. Bender's account kept moving from reader to reader. The men in black became recurring figures in American UFO folklore. They were said to appear after sightings or investigations. They warned people not to speak. Sometimes they seemed like government agents. Sometimes they seemed like something stranger, pretending to be government agents. But the center of the story still led back to Bender. In 1962, he published his own expanded account called "Flying Saucers and the Three Men." By then, Bender was no longer only the man who had shut down the International Flying Saucer Bureau. He was giving his own fuller version of what he said had happened. In that later book, the visitors were not simply men from an agency. Bender connected them to something non-human or otherworldly. The account had moved from a Bridgeport newspaper into UFO publishing. Then it moved again through Bender's own words. And each time, the same basic shape stayed in place. A room, a warning, a man who stopped. Bender's former neighborhood was eventually changed by redevelopment. The physical place where the Bureau operated, the streets and buildings around it, didn't remain the same. But people still returned to Bender. They returned to the house on Broad Street. They returned to World Contact Day. They returned to the final issue of Space Review. They returned to the image of 3 visitors standing near a desk and telling a man to stop publishing. The Bureau didn't last. the publication ended. The house and neighborhood changed, but Bender's warning kept traveling. By then, the men in black were no longer only Bender's visitors. They had become figures people could place into other UFO accounts. Dark-suited strangers who arrived after a sighting, asked questions, delivered warnings, and left witnesses unsure who they had really been. Still, underneath all of that, the original human shape remained. Albert Bender built something. He reached outward. He said something reached back. Then he walked away, and the account kept moving without him. So where does that leave us with Albert Bender? If you pull away the decades of folklore, the pieces we can actually touch are remarkably solid. Albert Bender was real. The International Flying Saucer Bureau was real. Space Review was real. World Contact Day happened. The final warning was printed, and the Bureau did shut down. Those facts give the case a firm historical spine. The moment we step inside Bender's house in July of 1953, though, the ground becomes much less certain. There are no verified photographs of the three visitors. There are no official records showing government agents were sent to 784 Broad Street. No independent witness had confirmed what Bender said happened inside that room. At the center of one of UFO history's most enduring legends, there's ultimately one man's account. That leaves us looking at Albert Bender from three different angles. There's the documented Bender, the Bridgeport timekeeper who built one of the country's earliest civilian UFO organizations from an upstairs room in his house. There's the reported Bender, the man who said three dark-clothed visitors entered the room and warned him to stop. And there's the legendary Bender, the figure whose account became the foundation of the modern Men in Black story. Those three versions overlap, but they're not identical. One of the biggest questions is how Bender's account changed over time. The earliest public versions suggest visitors who felt official, men whose authority fit naturally into the atmosphere of Cold War America, where secrecy and government power already shaped the public imagination. Years later, when Bender published Flying Saucers and the Three Men, the story expanded. The visitors became more explicitly otherworldly. Details like sulfur, yellow mist, and non-human beings entered the account. That shift matters because it changes the story the audience is being asked to evaluate. A warning from government officials and a warning from non-human visitors are very different claims, even if they begin with the same reported experience. The later details are among the most memorable parts of the legend, but they're also among the hardest to firmly place in the earliest version of the case. They helped shape how generations of readers remembered Albert Bender, even if they appear more securely in later retellings than in the first public accounts. The most grounded explanation remains a practical one. Running a volunteer organization with hundreds of members from an attic room required time, money, and constant effort. Small publications fail. Volunteer groups lose momentum. It's entirely possible the Bureau was already becoming difficult to sustain, and the reported warning gave dramatic shape to a decision that might have happened anyway. But that explanation alone doesn't account for why the story endured. Bender's account connected curiosity with consequence. It connected private investigation with outside pressure. And it connected the simple act of asking questions with the fear of being told to stop. Whether those visitors were government officials, something genuinely unexplained, or the beginning of a legend that grew over time, the historical result is the same. Albert Bender stopped publishing. He closed the International Flying Saucer Bureau, and the story he left behind kept traveling. The strongest evidence in the case is not proof that 3 mysterious visitors entered his home. It's the documented change that followed. A man who had devoted himself to organizing reports, publishing newsletters, and encouraging others to investigate suddenly shut everything down and warned people to be cautious. That doesn't tell us who, if anyone, came to his house. But it does leave us with the same question that has lingered since 1953. What happened inside that room on Broad Street that convinced Albert Bender never to publish another issue of Space Review again? What interests me most about Albert Bender is that the case doesn't really behave like a normal UFO story. There's no famous object hanging over a highway. There's no field full of witnesses. There's no police chase or military response. The most important thing happens indoors, in a private room, between one man and 3 figures we only know through his account. But somehow, it made it bigger. Because the fear in this case is not just fear of the unknown. It's fear of consequence. Bender's story asks what happens when curiosity starts to feel unsafe. He wanted to know more. He wanted to organize reports. He wanted to reach whatever he believed was behind the flying saucer mystery. Then, in the story he told, the mystery crossed a line. It entered his home. That's a different kind of fear. A strange light in the sky can be watched from the ground. A report can be filed. A newsletter can be printed. But when the unknown appears in the room where you live and tells you to stop, curiosity changes. And I think that's why the Men in Black became such a durable idea. They give a body to the fear that someone knows what you saw. Someone knows what you said. Someone knows you're planning to tell other people. For UFO culture, the image was almost perfect. It fit the Cold War. It fit the suspicion of government secrecy. It fit the feeling that witnesses were carrying information they weren't supposed to have. But it also works outside UFOs. People understand the fear of pressure. They understand being warned off something. They understand the feeling that asking the wrong question might bring attention you didn't want. That's where the Bender story still has power. It doesn't require the listener to decide immediately whether the 3 men were government agents, aliens, or folklore. The more human question comes first. Why did this man stop? Why did his warning feel serious enough for others to remember? And why did that image, 3 dark figures arriving with knowledge and authority, become one of the most recognizable symbols in paranormal culture? Maybe the answer is that the Men in Black are less about what they are and more about what they do. They arrive after the encounter. They make silence feel safer than speech. Albert Bender's bureau disappeared. His neighborhood changed. The original room is gone. But the warning stayed in circulation. And that may be the real legacy of the case. Not proof, not disclosure. A figure at the door telling the witness that the story ends here. This has been State of the Unknown. Albert Bender's story remains one of those cases where the documented facts and the folklore are tightly wrapped around each other. There was a real man in Bridgeport, a real UFO bureau, a real publication, and a real shutdown. Then there was a claim that 3 dark-clothed men entered his home and warned him to stop. What survived was the shape of that warning, a private room, papers gathered by strangers, and a man who had been reaching for the unknown suddenly stepping back from it. If you've been enjoying these stories, leaving a rating or review in your podcast app really does help more people find the show. On Spotify, it's just a tap of the stars. On Apple Podcasts, you can even leave a short written review. I read them and I appreciate every one. And if you want to make sure you don't miss the next story, just hit follow or subscribe in your podcast app so it shows up automatically when it drops. Until next time, stay curious. And who knows? Maybe the next strange knock at the door is just someone in the neighborhood. Or maybe they already know what you've been looking for.